Hello, everyone. Welcome to this month's session of the Woolf Post-Kantian Philosophy Seminar. The seminar meets monthly. The seminar began last year in August, so this is now our 7th meeting. For those of you who haven't attended a seminar in the past, I'll just mention briefly the format of the session. The speaker will give a talk of roughly 45 minutes to an hour, and then that'll be followed by a discussion period. So feel free to ask questions or make comments if you happen to have any. Today's session will be recorded and posted online, so that'll be made available on the Woolf YouTube site. So if you have friends and colleagues who aren't able to be here presently, feel free to mention that the proceedings will be available to view later. And sessions of our previous talks are also available on the Woolf YouTube site as well. Our speaker today is Dr. Katerina Koci. Dr. Koci is a philosopher and theologian who specializes in phenomenology, existentialism, and also hermeneutics. Her first book was published with Bloomsbury in 2021. It was entitled, The Land Without Promise, The Roots and Afterlife of One Biblical Illusion. And Dr. Katerina Koci, a primary focus of hers is transcendence and sacrifice. And she's published a number of articles and anthology chapters, including a piece recently with a volume that I edited that appeared last month with SUNY called Life Above the Clouds, Philosophy in the Films of Terrence Malick. So if you're interested in the work that she presents today on the question of sacrifice, I highly recommend checking out her essay in that volume as well. Her talk today is, as I mentioned, going to continue this theme on discussions of transcendence and freedom. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Katerina.
Thank you, Stephen. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to talk to you today. As Stephen has already said, my name is Katerina. I am a postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, Austria. And my research profile is biblical and philosophical hermeneutics. And switching from the topic of the promised land to sacrifice, I'll state with some of the topics from my past, and that is the hermeneutics of art and interpretation of art in philosophy and theology. Why sacrifice? Why switching the themes, the topics? It just came when we started a family with my husband Martin, who is also a theologian and a philosopher, and our both lives became sacrificial. And I mean, it's a bit cheap to call it that way, but it's sometimes funny, and we make fun of it. Today, I had to pick up my daughter from school because she just threw up there, and I had to run there and reorganize the whole day with all the babysitting and everything. So that's why I feel comfortable talking about sacrifice. The topic of today's talk came to me 2 years ago, I think, when Stephen asked me to write a short essay for his project 316, and I started writing about 1,000 words about art and sacrifice. I used some of my knowledge from my dissertation and some of the material, but a large portion of my work was possible thanks to my friend, the artist Daniel Domik. He's a painter, half American, half Austrian, and he works quite a bit with me about my project. Last year, I helped him with his project, He is also the designer of the PowerPoint presentation, as one you can see. You can also check my website, which you can see on the screen, and the paintings and the motifs and the design is his. So he was kind of my influence for this part of my research on art and hermeneutics. The title of my talk today, Art and Sacrifice, Human Self-Transcendence Towards Freedom and Truth. And I chose a motto for this talk, one you can see also on the screen, and this is from the pen of the Czech philosopher Jan Patočka, who is also one of my large influences. This motto I liked very much whenever I talk with my friends, with my family, with other academics about art and how they understand art and whether it's important for them. They usually talk about art that they like, something that they want to be appealing to them in a sense of likeness and beauty, something that is likable. My own experience is that I don't like art that I like. I like to be surrounded by art that is in some sense inspirational, provocative. I like to be disturbed by art, and to this feeling fits very well this kind of motto. But the universe of artworks is not a peaceful museum in which the masterpieces lead a life full of peace coexistence. It is a universe of seeking and struggles. So this is not only the motto of my today's talk, but also the motto of my research about art and hermeneutics. But what is art? How does it influence us, and how does it change our experience with the world? What role, if any, does it play in our understanding of the world? These are but a few questions that have been asked down the centuries regarding our attempts to explore and understand the human condition with the help of an agent we ignore at our peril, that is art. Jan Patočka, I'm not sure if you are familiar with him, but he is a Czech philosopher of the 20th century, pupil of Husserl and Heidegger, phenomenologist who worked on many topics, not in a very systematic way. That's also why it's difficult to edit his work. But he also dealt with art and interpretation of art and hermeneutics of art. So Jan Patočka and Hans-Georg Gadamer, I'm sure you are familiar with Gadamer, two students of Martin Heidegger, have much to say on these phenomenological and hermeneutical questions, that is, questions about art and its interpretation. Basing their research on, but also criticizing the scholarship of their teachers Kant and Hegel, both thinkers reassess and redefine the nature of art and its role in the human struggle to attain understanding and truth. The truth, they believe, is not above or beyond the work of art, but lies rather in the work itself. This is important. This is the phenomenological turn in the hermeneutics of art, and it applies also to other disciplines, that the truth does not lay behind or beyond, but is in the work itself, be it art or, for example, biblical text. Biblical scholars work with a similar idea in their hermeneutics. They differ, that is Patočka and Gadamer, however, in their understanding of how that truth is disclosed. In this presentation, I will introduce art as a free but active endeavor or movement of human existence, which aims to transcend the everydayness of our lives and disclose the truth of meaning. and whose process of creation is best explained in terms of sacrifice. I will build up the argument in 3 steps. First, I will present the phenomenology of art as the third movement of human existence, which leads, like self-sacrifice in Patočka, towards absolute freedom, truth, and a disclosure of meaning. Secondly, I will put forward a hermeneutic for creating and also interpreting a work of art as a dance or a play, which presents the unique relationship between the artist and the art in terms of sacrifice or self-sacrifice. Finally, we will explore together a painting by the artist Daniel Doming and his description of his own creative process as being one of self-transcendence and indeed sacrifice. Like religion, I quote, like religion and science, art is a specific way in which spirit apprehends itself, while at the same time representing a stage in the return of the spirit to itself. The essential function of art, then, is to express truth. The truth of art is truth itself, spirit as the substance of being. End of quote. These are the words of Jan Patočka in his key essay on the phenomenology of art, entitled Art and Time. This is maybe interesting to point out. Patočka's work is not hugely translated into English, but you can reach this particular essay in the volume Art and Time. Art for Patočka is a significant agent for creating the mosaic that represents the picture or image of the world we live in and discloses its meaning. Art, in other words, is an important hermeneutical actor. Patočka's hermeneutic of art mainly addresses the question of visual art, which in his view best captures the role of art plays in the development of spirit. Even though Patočka speaks mainly about the visual arts, he also addresses the field of architecture and applied arts, that is design, which for him is a kind of philosophy applied because it concerns the world around us, the world we relate to, that is architecture and design. Patočka notes that in ancient Greece, art and philosophy or religion and episteme were inseparable, just as the temple was always a shrine inhabited by the pantheon and never simply an architectural gem. So a sculpture was as much a devotional artifact as it was a work of art. This understanding of the symbiotic relationship between art, philosophy, and episteme, of their unity and inseparability, began to die out, however, and disappeared altogether in the era of positivism. Gadamer addresses the phenomenon of art in more general terms, but is convinced, like Patočka, that art had a part in the hermeneutical process right up until the period of the Enlightenment, when the new empirical sciences made their appeal for complete objectivity and aesthetic experience was excluded. Hermeneutically speaking, art lost its objectivity and became objectified. From artwork, we got artifact, something passive, something which is acted upon and lacks its own agency to react. However, like his teacher Hegel, Gadamer believes that, and I quote, aesthetics becomes a history of worldviews, that is, a history of truth, as it is manifested in the mirror of art, end of quote. Gadamer also turns to Kant, who places art under a shadow of suspicion by making it a transcendental category. Gadamer observes, This raises the question of how one can do justice to the truth of aesthetic experience, Erfahrung, and overcome the radical subjectivization of the aesthetic that began with Kant's critique of aesthetic judgment, end of quote. Merold Westphal elaborates further on this notion and suggests that Kant attributed to aesthetics only an affective or emotional function which does not participate in our knowledge of reality. As a consequence, the modern humanities not only exclude art and aesthetics because they are purely subjective categories, but also make no attempt to search for the truth at all. The recognition of the validity of aesthetic experience in the process of understanding and knowledge is in fact a paradigm shift, which was a portent of postmodernity. Gadamer explains the role of art as a corrective by means of which the thinking reason escapes the prison of language and it is itself verbally constituted. And Gadamer in his hermeneutics of art relies on the work of Martin Heidegger and Friedrich Nietzsche. A big issue that is in the sacrificial debate and comes from the side of political philosophy, that is sacrifice also, is the role of social, the social role and politics. To what extent should sacrifice be a social or a political problem? And also, to what extent do we take art as a political or social problem? And from this point of view is important the work of Theodor Adorno. Theodor Adorno and the critical theory school are those who are mainly responsible for the debate whether art and sacrifice for us should be interpreted in the social political way. Adorno rightly points out that art is often critical, interruptive, and even provoking, and insists that it is interruptive component itself which elevates mere aesthetics to the level of art. A question then arises regarding the extent to which the work of art is a reaction or interpretation of the original, which can be seen in line with its other representatives, and the degree to which it is itself unique and original. For Adorno, art has a role in questioning what is otherwise taken for granted, planting seeds of productive doubt and offering new, hitherto unconsidered perspectives. Art's appeal, therefore, is in its use of original means to communicate the truth about the original. These means are not at the disposal of the original, which is a product of the empirical world. Art speaks through these particular and original means. It communicates with the empirical world, is dependent upon and deduced from that world, but is by its very nature sharply critical. In Adorno, the protest realizes itself supremely in the social political realm. It is interesting to note, however, Gadamer's view of the truth of art in relation to Patočka's phenomenology. The truth of the work of art is revealed only when two questions are considered together. What does the artwork mean, and how does this meaning correspond to our understanding? Interpretation is therefore required if the truth is to be revealed. Patočka agrees with Gadamer that the problem lies in the positivist hermeneutic, which refuses to acknowledge the role of art in understanding the world. a development which Patočka suggests can be traced back to Hegel and seen through the prism of what he calls the past character of art in Hegelian hermeneutics. Patočka is convinced, however, that this past character of art, as he calls it, is a hermeneutical misunderstanding of the nature of a work of art and its relationship to the world we live in, which was established in positivism and founded on such a mimesis which denies the role of application, is oriented towards the past, and declines to speak to the present. If I am about to say a few words about mimesis, in simple terms is imitation. It is something that is present in our everyday life. Children learn by imitating, so it is a natural process. But Patočka distinguishes two kinds of mimesis. One is mimesis that is a pure replication, a pure imitation, but then there is an advanced imitation, which is a metaphor. Brian Doyle suggests that metaphors are capable not only of creating new meaning, but also of depicting reality hidden in the metaphor. The metaphor therefore provides us with both timely truth and timeless truth, the one that is applied and the other is constitutive and does not change over time. Gadamer insists, therefore, that the work of art has both a temporal and temporal dimension and must be analyzed from both the synchronic and the diachronic perspective. It is the temporal dimension which causes us problems of understanding. The temporal dimension for Gadamer must be understood as diachronic from the time of the final composition, that is, not the way how it was created, but from the final composition of the work of art onwards, that is the history of reception, in other words. The time gap, according to positive hermeneutics, is seen as a bias, which places obstacles in our path in the mind of the author, which, according to positivist hermeneutics, is a hermeneutical key to understanding the work. The time gap can, however, contrary to the understanding of the positivist hermeneutics, be a productive feature, especially if we admit that we may never succeed in journeying into the mind of the author and thus reaching the so-called original meaning. Patočka's definition of the phenomenology of art is influenced by the work of the philosopher and social anthropologist Arnold Gehlen, who, Patočka notes, offers a unique perspective on art as the key factor in the formation and elevation of humanity. Against the materialistic views that are generally focused on tool making, that is, Gehlen explores the origins of art in religious and cultic ritual. Patočka recognizes three layers of meaning in a work of art. First come the formal elements, that is, materials, framing, style, technique, colors, and so on. The second layer contains the primary objects that we actually see on the painting: figures, animals, background, foreground, landscape, and so on. The final layer of ideal representation reveals itself to us through the previous two layers, speaking to us in metaphorical language and inviting us to interpret the painting holistically. What the painting stands for, what emotions it portrays, the nature of the dynamics between the particular figures. Over time, we see the importance of this layer of ideal representation waning and waxing, and now, in modern art, holding a position of prime importance. Patočka insists that art aims to speak to its own time and context, to criticize and to provoke. The debate between formalists, that is the pure art, art for art's sake, and the critical theorists I presented to you from the pen of Theodor Adorno, regarding the social political function of art is lively and endless. An exploration of this debate is beyond the scope of my presentation, but suffice to say here that there is no real need to distinguish sharply between the two positions. There is art that aspires to some sort of a social revolt, and there is art that does not. Moreover, the respective positions taken by Jauss and Adorno can be considered extreme. The usual understanding is to be found somewhere in between. Following Heidegger, he is concerned about the increasing instrumentalization of human being, and now I come to sacrifice and why I connect art and sacrifice. Instrumentalization of human being and the consumerism that goes hand in hand with it. In Patočka, then, art can serve as one of the elements in the struggle against consumerism and the instrumentalization and massification of human beings. In art, human beings aim for the truth and meaning of life and realize their freedom. And I quote, "Thus, contemporary art is an assertion of interiority and therefore of freedom. In art, human creativity does not serve as a pretext for anything else. The moment a person embarks on the adventure that is art, as they assert themselves as a fundamentally inalienable being, protesting against the invasion of exteriority. Art is an irrefutable manifestation of human being." End of quote. Furthermore, art is a protest against the renunciation of being, and I quote again, "Production is not human, but an objective process in the third person. If humans are indispensable to it, it is only as a force of production, as an essential cog in the machine. Viewed in this way, unchained production is in fact the imprisonment of humanity, insofar as we consider humans to be the original subjective force of activity." End of quote. In his heretical essays in the philosophy of history, Patočka counts art as a part of the self-transcending movement of human existence, the so-called third movement, or the movement of truth, which is unique and singular. Quote, "The movement of truth is the source of art, the expression of its open, futural character, the character of that which is coming." End of quote. This movement is also essential to sacrifice, or to be more precise, to self-sacrifice, even though I don't like distinguishing between self-sacrifice and sacrifice very much, because to what extent does someone really self-sacrifice? I mean, people do not kill themselves just, out of the blue, and there are lots of factors coming to it. So to me, it is a kind of a false distinction. Sacrifice in this respect is not understood in the way that is as the do ut des logic of exchange. I give up something to achieve something else. In Patočka's terminology, the non-authentic sacrifice, but as the self-emptying and self-denying movement to the point of one's own death for an ultimate good, be it freedom, be it good, God, love, and so on. Here Patočka talks about the sacrifice for nothing because freedom, God, love, and the like are not things, as opposed to the usual sacrifice for something. Patočka's point of departure in his exposition of authentic sacrifice, like his exposition of the phenomenology of art, Heidegger's warning against the technicization and instrumentalization of human life. The Gestell, that is, an enframing of human life, which does not serve as a means of progress, but rather as a mode of human existence. And I quote Patočka, "Sacrifice means precisely drawing back from the realm of what we can manage and order, and an explicit relation to which not being anything actual itself serves as the ground of the appearing of the all that is active and that senses rules over all." End of quote. Similarly, art can function as a move away from consumerism, as we saw. A work of art is not passive, but functions rather as an active agent with a creative force which in many respects aims to surpass its model and which reaches its supreme manifestation in modern art, which emphasizes interactivity between the work and the artist or the interpreter. Furthermore, and in contrast to Hegel, Patočka insists that the truth of the work of art is contained in the work itself. And we talked about this in the very beginning, the postmodern hermeneutics, which be it art or be it biblical text, for example, the truth is not hidden somewhere beyond or behind, but is in the work itself. And I quote, "Whereas art once served as an incubator for the emerging fields of science and philosophy, now it must be newly conquered as a realm of abstract conceptuality by the weapon of intellectual reflection, employed with great intensity." Countering the positivist notion of the dialectical subject-object relationship, Husserl sees the human perception of the world and our relationship to it as a cohesive process, a perspective which has a substantial impact on hermeneutics. Gadamer adopted Husserl's concept of the Lebenswelt, in which individuals are always seen as part of the whole to which they relate at every moment. What Husserl means, I quote, is that we cannot conceive subjectivity as the opposite of objectivity, because this concept of subjectivity would itself be conceived in the objective terms. Instead, his transcendental phenomenology seeks to be a correlation research, end of quote. Similarly, Patočka's hermeneutics of art is essentially phenomenological in the sense that it removes the border between the work and the artist. One acts upon the other. They are together in a movement as if dancing, or in the phenomenological or hermeneutical jargon, they are playing. That is interactive art, art which requires a response. This is why modern drama goes beyond the boundaries of the stage, attempting to bridge the theater-spectator divide. This modest hermeneutical observation brings us close to Gadamer's phenomenological hermeneutic of art. Gadamer explores and explains the hermeneutical processes that involve two partners who act as co-workers in the creation or reception of a work of art. Play always begins with the creation of the work and continues with every new interpretation. Play clearly represents an order in which the to and fro motion of play follows of itself. It is part of play, that is, the movement is not only without goal or purpose, but also without effort, end of quote. In Gadamer's terminology, everyone and everything involved in this hermeneutical process is perceived as a player. the actor or author, the interpreter, reactor, and the work itself. This play is an essential process in hermeneutics, as it is only when the play takes place, that is, when both partners are involved or more partners are involved, that we can talk about a text or piece of music or theater. For Patočka, however, art is the highest and most demanding exercise humans can engage in. The third and unique movement, which never happens by itself, but always requires the full engagement of the person. So this is the big difference, or a difference which I can see between Gadamer's and Patočka's hermeneutics of art, that for Gadamer, it is a playful act, it is a joyful movement, whereas for Patočka, it is something that is really extreme. It is something that exceeds the everydayness of life. It is not something that we kind of leisurely engage in. Westphal helpfully clarifies that the essence of the work of art is within the work itself, as we've already heard, not somewhere behind, as Platonists, for example, would have it. Gadamer agrees, but is faithful to the hermeneutics of his teacher Hegel in believing that it is the interpretation which enables the revelation of truth, and that philosophical interpretation has the greatest and highest relevance. And I quote, "The self-consciousness of spirit that, as the text has it, comprehends the truth of art within itself in a higher way, culminated in philosophy as absolute knowledge," end of quote. In this respect, we can conclude that Patočka privileges the purity of the human experience of art over the hermeneutical competence of the philosopher, as we see in Gadamer or in Hegel. I think, I'm not sure, but I think Gadamer follows the Hegel's lead in this respect, that not every day and not everyone on the street can really interpret art. It's the role of the philosopher who is to interpret and give us the response, and we should listen to the great philosopher who is only able to do the correct interpretation. But I'll be interested in what you think, Stephen, about this. And now I'll give maybe like a kickoff to the discussion with this. So this is Daniel Domik. This is my friend, the artist, and also a lay philosopher and theologian. He likes to read Jean-Luc Marion, for example, and he works with me on projects, as I've said. And this is the case study for my presentation, and it's the painting down from the tree. I should not project his interpretation, but maybe leave you to think about what could be the kind of, what could be the answer to this image, what could it represent, and so on.
Do you want to turn to discussion now?
Yes, yeah, I think, yeah, let's not overdo it. I can give some points about my own interpretation later if you're interested, but we can kick off the discussion now.
Oh, fantastic. Well, so, I mean, first of all, there's so many questions I want to put to you. So hopefully I don't try your patience, because I have a lot that I want to ask you. I mean, eventually I want to work up to the question of Patočka. I mean, he's a very important 20th century phenomenologist, but as you note, he's not that well known or particularly influential in the English-speaking world. And so eventually, I want to hear from you what you think about Patočka's view of art distinguishes him from some of the better known phenomenology. And another thing is, you mentioned meaning. And of course, for phenomenology, meaning is a really essential category, the phenomenological conception of meaning. And I think this has something to do with the corollary notion of truth that's at stake in phenomenological philosophy, and maybe something about how art, as you're understanding it, is expressive of truth or expressive of meaning, or in some respect, a pursuit of meaning and art. But before I get to those sorts of questions and turn to questions I have about the relationship between philosophy and art, I mean, maybe it's best to start things off with a discussion about the nature of philosophy itself as you understand it. So, I mean, one of the things that immediately came to my mind is when you look at the phenomenological tradition, someone like Husserl, and then Heidegger as well in his early thinking, conceives of phenomenological philosophy as in some sense a science. And then, of course, hermeneutics is considered an art of interpretation. And nevertheless, hermeneutics and phenomenology are very much entwined. And some have thought that there is such a thing as hermeneutical phenomenology, or that maybe phenomenology is only possible as hermeneutics. So I think my preliminary question for you is, what do you take to be the relationship between phenomenology and hermeneutics? And what's going on there? What distinguishes the two, if anything, and how are the two related vis-a-vis this background issue about the relationship between science and art?
So I'll start with this second question, and then I'll come back to Patočka and his translations into English. Okay,
sure.
Yeah. So so phenomenology and hermeneutics, there are two hermeneutists that I work and like to work with, and one is Gadamer and the other is Jean Craich. And both of them could be called phenomenological hermeneutists. And their work is different from, for example, the work of Merold Westphal, whom I also quoted and invoked in my interpretation, in my presentation. And why phenomenological hermeneutics? That's the phenomenological aspect there is the one that it involves the individual and his or her experience and capacity and capability to interpret. And the art and yeah, art and science, as you mentioned, is it's a tricky question, and it's not really fair, I would say, to hermeneutics to call it art, even though art of interpretation, because there is a lot of work done behind that is based on some knowledge, hard knowledge, not only kind of some intellectual play. Gadamer and his work is largely misinterpreted in biblical scholarship, for example, but also in philosophy. You have as many interpreters of Heidegger, of Gadamer, as there are his interpretations. For example, biblical scholars above all blame him for not being enough empirical and basing his work on knowledge and so on. But I honestly, I don't have a better answer to your question than the one that, yes, it is art. It is a way of, like, it's not empirical science, but on the other hand, it's not just blowing in the wind. It's based on historical facts, so to say, not facts in the empirical and in the empirical way, but yeah, I guess I don't have a better answer, and this is something I guess we are struggling with in this field. But if you have a better lead, then please share it with me.
Well, I wonder if it has something to do with this notion of meaning, right? Because, I mean, if you take meaning as like a disclosure of truth, right? Then the philosophical claim, I think, for the phenomenologist is that we have access to truth in many ways, and so meaning, right, isn't just merely a linguistic phenomenon. So I know, like, this is, I think, one of the things that, like, you mentioned, I think the tradition of positivism and materialism not making easy room for art. And I wonder if that's because, you know, a lot of those philosophers, they take the locus classicus of truth to be like the proposition, right? Which is something that's expressed linguistically. And of course, I mean, there are like linguistic forms of art, like, you know, poetry or literature. But I mean, painting, for example, which I know you have an example of one here, which we'll get to in a moment, is interesting because in a way, I think when we look at a painting, there's a meaning at stake, something that we see or encounter. But it may be difficult to actually put it into words. And so I don't know. I mean, I'm wondering if maybe that's also what makes it hermeneutic, the encounter that it calls for interpretation, is that, well, you know, hermeneutics began as a sort of art of interpreting a text, but there's also a way in which we can interpret artworks, which aren't necessarily linguistic.
I think the key factor is that the meaning discloses within the play or within the dance, that it's interactive, that it's not like, you know, making making a chemical you know, substance in the lab, where of course you also have to interpret and choose between the important results and less important results. So this is also kind of, you know, even though the hard scientists wouldn't really admit that, it also involves interpretation, and also the selection is interpretation and so on. But in art, to come back, in art, it's much more at stake. The disclosure of meaning that is in the art itself, but it's also on the line between the author or the interpreter and the artwork. And if I may, yeah.
Oh no, go ahead. Interrupt.
Yeah, to your question about Patočka and his work being not widely read, this has a simple. There is a simple answer to your question. It's because he is not very well translated into English. There are a few works, for example, the heretical essays, that were already translated, but the vast majority of work only exists in Czech or in German or in French. Patočka's work, some of it originated already in German or in French and was translated later to Czech, which is a bit funny. But we do not have the translator into English. There was a recent attempt from Erin Plunkett, a phenomenologist from the UK, who translated a selection of Patočka's work and gave it a title, Art and Time. But it is not a systematic translation, and it's a kind of, to be honest, a kind of a weird selection of Patočka's work, which do not really make much sense when put together. But yeah, it is meant to be an introductory sample of his work. It could serve like that, but Patočka scholars are not very happy about this.
What do you think distinguishes, if anything, Patočka's view of art or phenomenology from some of the thinkers that would be better known to? So I mean, because you mentioned a number, I mean, it sounds to me like his work is obviously very, very rich and historically informed. I mean, he's obviously a careful reader of the history of philosophy. You mentioned people like Hegel, Gadamer, Heidegger, all of whom have things to say that are relevant to Patočka's own concerns. But if you were to, for example, take like some of the other 20th century notable phenomenologists, such as like Heidegger or Merleau-Ponty, and their view of art, what would you say is unique or particularly interesting about what Patočka is doing that they're not, or how does he bring out certain insights that they may have as well, or that they just didn't perhaps develop?
I'd say that he truthful to Hegel, whom he admires quite a lot, and to Heidegger, he tries to be as methodological as possible. So he has these 3 layers of interpretation, and he really tries to be within hermeneutics, which is kind of unique, to really distinguish between what he's interpreting at present. So he takes a bunch of aspects that are obvious to everyone, be it the format, colors, figures, or so. Then he takes what he sees on the picture, what could it be, what could it represent, and then comes the 3rd layer, which is the most difficult, but also the most intriguing layer, which is the hermeneutical layer par excellence, I would say. And there it already starts to be a bit slippery. So to answer your question, I think it is Gadamer is blamed for not being enough methodological. So his book is called to be Truth Without Method, or all these funny titles. So I think that Patočka really tries to be methodological as much as possible, not caricaturing the art of interpretation itself. And the second, and that's what I think is distinct for him, is that that the truth could be disclosed to people who lack the philosophical apparatus, so to say.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because one other phenomenologist whose aesthetic theory seems in that last regard to be similar is Michel Henry. And I don't know if you're familiar with Michel Henry's work on Kandinsky, but this is, I mean, it seems like Patočka wants to locate the truth of the meaning of the artwork in the work itself, right? Of course, I mean, I think you mentioned that he some sense thinks that a work of art reflects a worldview or perhaps the historical time in which it was produced, but ultimately, right, like the locus of the meaning, the exhibition of the meaning occurs in the work itself. And so it doesn't necessarily require a theorist, right, to decode what's there. Mm-hmm. Presumably anyone just looking at it who's suitably attuned can get something valuable from it. Mm-hmm. I have a question. You had mentioned Hegel. So sort of maybe my final question, I want to get at this issue of the relationship between art and religion. Because of course for Hegel, or at least I think as Hegel's commonly interpreted, art is subordinated to philosophy, and of course religion is as well. And so I know at the beginning of your talk, you had something about Patočka making a point that art elevates the human spirit. And so I wonder if you could say something about what Patočka's view, if any, is about the relationship between artistic meaning, artistic truth, the sense in which art expresses transcendence, and how that's related to religious truth, or religious meaning, and the transcendence that's at stake in religion. But before we get to that, maybe we should turn to the painting. I mean, one thing, I don't know if I'm going to have anything too informative to say about it, but I mean, so I'm looking at it. Clearly, it seems to me like there's at least one human form or figure here. And then possibly, I mean, a second, more ambiguous, amorphous form on the left that it looks like there's like a kind of arm maybe off to the side. But given the title of the work, I'm assuming that maybe that's actually a tree. But so one thing that I want to ask you about the nature of this painting is, I mean, and this maybe gets at Patočka's own approach to art. But I mean, like in aesthetics theory, you have a number of views out there about what art is actually trying to show. So yeah, I think you mentioned formalism as one view, and then there's expressivism, and then there's more just like representational views of art. How would you classify this painting, or what do you think is like the sort of best approach to take when interpreting it? What exactly do you take the painting to be attempting to show?
So the author himself used to call himself a non-figurative painter whose figures always sneak in and they don't want to disappear. So
well, you see, I mean, I had mentioned Henri because this is what he thinks is so interesting about Kandinsky's abstraction, is that Henri has this very idiosyncratic view that art is supposed to be expressing life, the pathos of life. And he thinks that in order to do this, the painter has to liberate the visual form from the visible world. And this is what leads to abstraction rather than a focus on figuration or figurative form. And I was kind of inclined to go in that direction looking at this, but there again, I mean, it seems like maybe perhaps it was unintentional on the part of the artist, but there does seem to be a figure there. Although it's not straightforwardly like a representational form of art that's, for example, attempting to just replicate something in the world, right? So it's interesting in that regard.
I don't know. I think it's emotion above all what he wants to represent. And the figures are there just by accident or
You want to say something with an eye to concluding about the relationship between art and religion for Patočka?
Yeah.
Or what's going on there? Because I mean, like, you know, that's obviously a huge. You had mentioned at one point Schiller, and of course that's a huge discussion for the German idealists and a lot of 19th century philosophers. What's the relationship between art and religion? So
yeah, so for Patočka, religion, philosophy, and art are the result of the third movement of existence, that is the movement that transcends. And I think Jacques Derrida in his book, The Gift of Death, grabs very well the interpretation of religion in Patočka's work as sacrifice. So if there is any reason, any reason to hold to religion, it's the going out from oneself and giving oneself to the other. So both art and religion in Patočka's work are the highest possible movements of human existence, and there is no hierarchy in the sense that philosophy or religion or philosophy, religion, art. So they are equal, and they are, as I've said, also in relation to Gadamer's work. There is there is no hierarchy, and we don't need like someone else, the philosopher, to interpret the art for us. So
just a quick follow-up. So when you say that there's no hierarchy, does that mean that Patočka thinks that that in other words, there's nothing that religion is onto that art in principle couldn't also disclose? So I mean, like, for example, if you think about someone like Kierkegaard, like one of the things that people have thought he's up to in his spheres of existence, the well-known distinction among the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious, is that Kierkegaard is trying to make some sort of claim that there's a dimension of meaning or truth, namely the religious, that can't be understood or conveyed but by religious means. And so in some sense, this kind of limits what art is capable of expressing. Is that a view that you think Patočka would reject?
I don't know. So as I've said during the presentation, Patočka is not a very systematic worker. So you don't have a heading sacrifice, and then there you would have like a systematic exposition of what sacrifice is or what sacrifice is not. So but to your question, I would say that that there is nothing that could be revealed or disclosed by religion that it cannot be disclosed by art. At least this is my understanding.
Is there anything that you'd like to add before we conclude?
Maybe I can just project. I mean, I have my own interpretation of the painting, but I don't think it's so overly important. But we can maybe go to the artist interpretation. And to which I say one maybe a funny note. I asked my friend to provide an image that could look like sacrificial, and he gave me a selection, and I chose this one, and then I did my own interpretation, and which was full of technical terms, and then I asked him to give his own interpretation, which is very philosophical or even theological or spiritual, I would say. So he said that we swapped our vocations, that he is more like a theologian and I am more like an art critic to him. But going back to what he said about his painting, so And the motto he chose for his painting is taken from Rowan Williams, the former flesh is more than it is, gives more than it has. I wonder what it must have been like removing the dead body of Christ from the cross, so that now we know that the tree is actually the cross. I imagine it even worse than watching him hang there. After all the challenge uttered by the Roman soldier in Matthew 27:40 to come down from the cross and save himself must have made the hearts of his followers jump with one last beat of hope. This certainly would be the perfect movement for Jesus to prove himself once and for all, to remove all doubts. Instead, we end up at the moment that has been depicted often in the history of painting, the removal of his body from the cross. In all depictions, we find a similar conglomerate of bodies, multiple heads, arms, and hands joined together in supporting his hanging limbs. The dead Christ, now present as fully human, the rest swathing bands. Those surrounding him are left with the same question the shepherds must have had when encountering the newborn in Bethlehem. Can this be more than just a body? So this is the, I'd say, spiritual interpretation of the painting. So
well, it also answers my question, which is, can art express the religious? This would, if successful, be a work of art that suggests that that's possible, or at least that the artist can take up an explicitly religious subject by artisans. Yeah. Is there anything you'd like to add before we conclude?
maybe there is one thing from my paper which I would like to quote, and that's the way how the artist feels as a sacrifice or self-sacrificing himself while painting. That's what I think is interesting on Daniel's work, and the way he interprets his painting in the way of the third movement of existence in the sacrificial way, in words of Jan Patočka. That there is a real sense of sacrifice as a loss that I feel when I paint. This is, of course, not necessarily the feeling of every painter. Some painters make their steps very carefully to avoid any losses, because sacrifice is oftentimes connected to some sort of a failure, or so it is understood. But when it comes to my own work, I have a certain form with which I start to work and which transforms into something different when I proceed. I lose the original form and I cannot go back to it. I cannot save the earlier forms as if I were saving a text. If you write a text for the whole day and still you realize that the updated version is not good, you can sacrifice, quote unquote, this work and go back to the previous versions. My painting is a constant movement full of changes. So if I realize that I have made a mistake and I want to change something which does not work, it also means that I have lost everything, at least for that moment, it seems to me. But it is true that after some time, I discovered that these layers of the lost work give rise to something else, something new and fascinating. They give rise to the final layer, which would never be so vivid and complete if it was not fed by the previous layers. End of quote. that's kind of inspirational for me. That's
Beautiful.
what we know about the art as we can see it, as we watch the image. We do not see immediately this kind of sacrifice and self-sacrifice, the process, the layers, and the, you know, that it could have been done in kind of long term, that there were some paintings that were just, you know, not good, or for the artists were not good, but they gave rise to something that is meaningful at the moment. So in a sense, it is like an illustration for sacrifice, which may sometimes seem like an utter loss with no good at all, but in the long run, it can reveal something that is meaningful.
No, I like this image. It's I mean, one way to put it perhaps is to say that it's a view of artistic practice as itself in some way as being kenotic, as a form of emptying oneself. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today and to share the presentation. And so I think without further ado, we'll end here. And as I said, the proceeding has been recorded, so that will be made available on the Woolf YouTube site soon, okay?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.